The skyline of Austin sparkled outside the glass walls of the penthouse, each light a pinprick of hope in the dark. Naomi tightened her grip on the pregnancy test in her hand, her heart pounding with equal parts excitement and trepidation. Tonight, everything would change. She'd spent the past 3 years building a life with Antonio, a life that now included the tiny heartbeat she carried within her. She glanced at the clock, its soft tick-tick, a reminder of time slipping away. Antonio should have been home an hour ago, but late nights were routine for him. Meetings, calls, or sometimes elaborate dinners with investors. Naomi reminded herself that this was his world, ambition and business. Still, tonight was different. She smoothed her palms over her blouse, imagining his reaction when she shared the news. The sound of the door unlocking snapped her out of her thoughts. Antonio entered, his tailored suit immaculate as always, the sharp lines of his jaw set in a way that suggested tension. He loosened his tie, barely sparing Naomi a glance as he tossed his briefcase onto the couch. "Hey," she said softly, stepping forward, her voice trembling with excitement. "You're home." Antonio grunted in response, pouring himself a drink from the bar cart. His lack of enthusiasm made her hesitate, but she steeled herself. "Antonio, I have something to tell you." He finally turned to face her, his brow furrowing slightly. "Can it wait? It's been a long day." "No, it can't," Naomi said firmly, though her hands trembled. She held up the test, its 2 pink lines stark against the white plastic. "I'm pregnant." For a moment, silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. Antonio stared at the test, his face unreadable. Then he exhaled sharply, placing his drink on the counter with a deliberate clink. "Naomi, I can't do this." The words hit her like a physical blow. "What do you mean you can't do this?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "This is our child." Antonio avoided her gaze, his jaw tightening. "The company's expanding. We're moving operations to Singapore next month. I was going to tell you over dinner." "We?" Naomi's voice rose in disbelief. "Then we'll move together. Antonio, this is our family now." He shook his head, taking a step back. "There is no we in this decision, Naomi. The merger's already approved. I'm marrying Kira next month." Naomi stumbled as if the ground had vanished beneath her feet. "Kira? Your investor's daughter?" she whispered. "How long has this been going on?" "It's not what you think," Antonio replied coldly. "It's business. The merger requires—" "Business?" Naomi cut him off, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "I'm carrying your child, and you're talking to me about mergers." Antonio grabbed his briefcase, avoiding her tear-filled gaze. "You'll be taken care of. I'll have my lawyers handle everything." "Your lawyers?" Naomi stepped forward, her voice shaking with fury. "Look me in the eye and tell me the last 3 years meant nothing." For the first time, Antonio looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes wasn't guilt or regret. It was emptiness. "I'm sorry," he said mechanically, "but I have to go." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Naomi standing alone in the silence. Her hand instinctively went to her stomach as tears streamed down her face. From this moment, everything had changed. Naomi stood frozen in the middle of the penthouse, her thoughts swirling in a storm of disbelief and anger. The faint sound of the city outside felt distant, almost like it belonged to another world, one where she hadn't just been abandoned by the man she loved. She sank into the nearest chair, clutching the pregnancy test in her hand as if it were her only anchor to reality. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, breaking the oppressive silence. For a moment, she thought it might be Antonio, that he'd come to his senses and was calling to apologize. But when she checked the screen, it was a message from Bella. "How did it go? Did you tell him?" Naomi's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her throat tightening as fresh tears threatened to fall. How could she explain what had just happened? That Antonio had chosen power and wealth over their family, that he'd left her and their unborn child behind without a shred of hesitation. She typed a single word: "He's gone." A sharp pang of nausea suddenly hit her, and she rushed to the bathroom, barely making it to the sink before she vomited. Her body trembled as she leaned against the cold porcelain, waves of sickness and despair rolling over her. When she finally managed to lift her head, her reflection stared back at her in the mirror, pale, tear-streaked, and unrecognizable. "This isn't who I am," she whispered hoarsely, gripping the edge of the counter. "I'm stronger than this." Drawing a shaky breath, Naomi splashed cold water on her face. The pregnancy test lay on the counter beside her, its 2 pink lines now blurred by stray droplets. She picked it up carefully, staring at it for a long moment before slipping it into her pocket. It wasn't just a test. It was evidence of the life growing inside her, the reason she couldn't let Antonio's betrayal destroy her. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a notification from a news app. Crawford Technologies announces merger with Zhang Enterprises, CEO Antonio Crawford to wed Kira Zhang in Singapore next month. The room spun. Naomi gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself, her vision narrowing as anger began to replace the despair. The man who had promised her forever under the stars had already planned his future without her. He wasn't just leaving. He had orchestrated every step, ensuring she'd have no place in his new life. She stumbled back into the living room, the sterile luxury of the penthouse now feeling suffocating and cold. Her gaze fell on the pile of financial documents Antonio had left on the dining table the week before, stacks of papers detailing his plans to move everything to Singapore. Everything was in his name: the accounts, the property, even the car. He'd planned for every contingency except one: her resolve. Naomi's phone buzzed a third time, this time with a call from Bella. She answered, her voice raw but steady. "Bella, I need to stay with you tonight." "Of course," Bella replied immediately. "I'll come get you." "No," Naomi said firmly. She glanced around the penthouse one last time, her decision crystallizing. "I'll meet you there." As Naomi stepped out into the night, the cool air hit her like a wake-up call. She clutched her keys tightly, each step away from the penthouse feeling like a small victory. She wasn't walking away from a life Antonio had built for her. She was walking toward a future she'd build for herself and her child. The city lights stretched before her, vibrant and full of possibilities. Naomi didn't know exactly how she would rebuild her life, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't let Antonio's betrayal define her. For the sake of the tiny heartbeat inside her, she would rise. Naomi woke to the faint hum of traffic outside Bella's apartment. The guest room was small but cozy, with warm yellow walls and a quilted blanket draped over the bed. She hadn't slept much, her mind replaying every moment of the previous night. The shock of Antonio's betrayal, the emptiness in his eyes, and the cold finality of his words. She rubbed her temples, pushing herself upright. The faint aroma of coffee drifted in from the kitchen, reminding her that the world kept turning, no matter how shattered she felt. She rested her hand on her stomach, her resolve hardening. This was no longer about her. She had someone else to fight for now. In the kitchen, Bella was bustling around in scrubs, her hair tied back in a messy bun. "Morning," she said, handing Naomi a mug. Her voice was casual, but her eyes scanned Naomi carefully, searching for cracks in her composure. "Thanks," Naomi said quietly, taking a sip. The warmth steadied her nerves, though it couldn't fully erase the heaviness in her chest. Bella leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You don't have to talk about it, but if you want to, I'm here." Naomi exhaled slowly, staring into her coffee. "He's gone," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of the words. He's marrying Kira next month. It was all planned. He was just waiting for the right moment to leave. Bella's jaw tightened. That... She cut herself off, gripping the counter. He doesn't deserve to be a father. Naomi's throat tightened. I have to do this alone. He's made that clear. You're not alone, Bella said firmly, stepping closer. You've got me. You've got the team at the hospital. And I know you're tough as hell, Naomi. Naomi smiled faintly, grateful for Bella's unwavering support. But the thought of facing the world, of juggling her demanding career while preparing for motherhood, felt insurmountable. It just feels like too much, she admitted. It's not, Bella said, and you're going to prove it, because you always do. The clock on the wall caught Naomi's eye, and a wave of reality crashed over her. She had a shift at the hospital in less than an hour. As much as she wanted to curl up and let the world fade away, her patients needed her. Bella seemed to read her mind. Get dressed. I'll give you a ride. By the time they arrived at St. David's, the familiar chaos of the hospital was already in full swing. Nurses and doctors buzzed through the corridors, their hurried footsteps echoing off the sterile walls. Naomi was greeted by Jacob Rivera, a nurse with a sharp wit and an easygoing demeanor that masked a deep well of compassion. Morning, Naomi, Jacob said, raising an eyebrow at the dark circles under her eyes. Rough night? You could say that, Naomi replied, pulling on her white coat. Well, you're just in time, Jacob said, his tone light but his eyes serious. We've got a pediatric case in the OR, a 5-year-old with a ruptured appendix. Dr. Lasker asked for you. Naomi nodded, grateful for the distraction. As she scrubbed in for surgery, the weight on her chest lifted slightly. Here in the OR, she could focus entirely on saving lives. For a few hours at least, she could forget about her own shattered one. The familiar rhythm of surgery steadied Naomi's hands as she worked with precision, the room around her fading into a blur of sterile efficiency. The ruptured appendix was worse than anticipated, and the child's vitals wavered dangerously. Hold suction here, she instructed Jacob, who nodded, his usual banter replaced by quiet focus. BP's stabilizing, the anesthesiologist announced, a note of relief in his voice. Naomi's lips tightened in concentration. Good. Let's close up quickly and minimize risk for infection. Minutes stretched into an hour, but when the final suture was placed, Naomi stepped back, exhaling deeply. Vitals? Strong and steady, Jacob confirmed, glancing at the monitors. A faint smile crossed Naomi's face. Good work, everyone. As the team moved to transfer the child to recovery, Naomi stripped off her gloves and stepped into the hallway. The adrenaline of the surgery gave way to exhaustion, but also a flicker of pride. No matter how chaotic her personal life became, she could still find purpose here. Jacob joined her a few moments later, leaning casually against the wall. Another life saved by Dr. Naomi. No big deal. His grin was disarming, but his eyes held genuine admiration. Naomi shook her head, letting a small laugh escape. It's a team effort. You're part of it too, you know. Well, don't get used to me being nice, Jacob teased. I've got a reputation to maintain. The moment of levity was interrupted by Bella, who approached them with a clipboard in hand. Naomi, I've scheduled you for an ultrasound appointment during your lunch break. Don't argue, she said before Naomi could protest. You're not skipping this. Naomi sighed, but nodded. She hadn't allowed herself to think much about the baby since last night, pushing the emotions aside to focus on work. But now, with her first appointment looming, the reality felt inescapable. During lunch, Bella accompanied her to the OB/GYN department, the mood shifting to a quiet solemnity. Naomi lay back on the examination table, her pulse quickening as the technician prepared the equipment. All right, let's take a look, the technician said, her tone professional yet kind. The sound of the ultrasound machine filled the room, followed by a rhythmic thumping that made Naomi's breath hitch. "There's your baby," the technician said, pointing to the screen. The blurry black and white image glowed softly, but Naomi's eyes locked on the tiny, flickering heartbeat. She hadn't expected the wave of emotion that hit her. Tears welled up, unbidden, as she stared at the screen. For the first time since Antonio walked out, she felt something other than loss. She felt hope. Bella, standing nearby, placed a hand on Naomi's shoulder. "You've got this," she said quietly. "You're going to be an incredible mom." Naomi nodded, wiping her eyes. "I have to be," she whispered, her resolve solidifying. "For them." As they left the clinic, Naomi's phone buzzed with a message from the hospital's administration. A new project proposal was being reviewed, one she had worked tirelessly on to improve pediatric care. Bella glanced at her. "That's the next step, isn't it?" Naomi smiled faintly, the flicker of hope growing stronger. "Yeah, it is." She looked up at the hospital looming ahead, her determination rekindling. She would rebuild, step by step, for herself and for the future she was carrying. Naomi's hands trembled as she gripped the sides of the hospital bed, another sharp contraction ripping through her. The bright fluorescent lights of the delivery room reflected off the sterile white walls, but everything around her felt distant, muffled by the pain and the pounding of her own heartbeat. She'd expected labor to be intense, but she hadn't anticipated it would happen like this, in the middle of a chaotic double shift at the hospital. Bella's voice cut through the haze. "Breathe, Naomi. Deep breaths in and out. You've got this." Naomi groaned through clenched teeth, her body tense as she fought against the overwhelming pressure. She'd started feeling cramps earlier during a surgery, but had dismissed them as Braxton Hicks contractions. It wasn't until she nearly collapsed in the hallway that Bella had intervened, ordering her to stop pretending she wasn't in labor and head straight to the maternity ward. The nurse beside her adjusted the IV, her tone calm but firm. "We're almost there, Doctor. Ramirez, you're doing great. Just a little longer." I can't," Naomi gasped, the words escaping her in a ragged breath. "Yes, you can," Bella said, gripping Naomi's hand tightly. "You're the strongest person I know, Naomi, and you're about to meet your baby." The reminder sent a fresh wave of resolve through Naomi, though her body felt like it was at its limit. She pushed through the next contraction, her mind filled with flashes of what had brought her to this moment. Antonio walking out, her struggles to rebuild her life, and the tiny flicker of hope she'd seen on the ultrasound screen just weeks ago. The room buzzed with activity as the OB/GYN team prepared for the final stages. Naomi caught a glimpse of Jacob rushing into the room, his scrubs slightly disheveled. He skidded to a stop at her bedside, his usual humor replaced with genuine concern. "I heard," he said, slightly out of breath. "What do you need? Moral support? Bad jokes? A distraction?" Naomi let out a choked laugh, her hand instinctively reaching for his. "Just be here," she whispered. Jacob nodded, his grip steady and grounding. "Always." The doctor in charge gave a nod to Naomi. "All right, Naomi. One more big push, and we'll have this baby." Time seemed to blur as Naomi summoned every ounce of strength she had left. A final push, a piercing cry, and then the world seemed to still. The nurse handed her a small, wriggling bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Here's your son," the doctor said with a warm smile. Naomi stared down at him, her breath catching in her throat. Henry's tiny face was scrunched in a mix of confusion and determination, his cries loud and healthy. Tears spilled down Naomi's cheeks as she cradled him close, overwhelmed by the fierce protective love that surged through her. Naomi traced her finger gently along Henry's tiny cheek, marveling at the soft warmth of his skin. His cries had quieted, replaced by little hiccups as he nestled against her chest. She barely noticed the bustle of the medical staff cleaning up around her, or the quiet murmurs of congratulations from the nurses. All she could see, all she could feel, was her son. Bella stood nearby, her expression softening as she wiped tears from her own eyes. "He's perfect, Naomi," she whispered, moving closer. "Look at him, already a fighter, just like his mum." Naomi gave a watery laugh, brushing her thumb over Henry's small, clenched fist. "I can't believe he's here," she said softly. "After everything, he's here." Jacob, who had stayed by her side through the entire ordeal, leaned in to get a closer look. "All right, I'll admit it. He's got my approval. Though he might give you some trouble later with that determined expression," he joked, though his voice carried a rare tenderness. Naomi smiled, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "He's going to be amazing. I can feel it." The moment was interrupted by a nurse gently tapping Naomi's shoulder. "Dr. Ramirez, I hate to interrupt, but we need to run a few routine tests for the baby." Naomi hesitated, reluctant to let Henry go even for a moment. Bella, sensing her unease, stepped in. "I'll go with him," she offered, her voice reassuring. "Make sure they take extra good care of him." Naomi nodded reluctantly, pressing a soft kiss to Henry's forehead before handing him over. "Thank you," she murmured. As the nurse and Bella left the room, Jacob pulled up a chair beside Naomi. "You did it," he said simply, his tone filled with admiration. Naomi leaned back against the pillows, her body aching but her heart full. "I didn't think I could," she admitted. "Not after everything." "Well, you proved yourself wrong," Jacob said, his gaze steady. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for." Naomi met his eyes, her expression softening. "Thank you for being here." Jacob shrugged, but his smile was genuine. "Where else would I be?" Before Naomi could respond, Bella returned with Henry in her arms, beaming. "He passed every test with flying colors," she announced, placing the baby carefully back in Naomi's arms. "Healthy as can be." Naomi cradled Henry close once more, a wave of relief washing over her. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one she hadn't expected, but was ready to embrace. She glanced up at Bella and Jacob, her found family, and felt a flicker of hope ignite. "We're going to be okay," Naomi said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. "All of us." And as she looked down at Henry, his tiny hand curling around her finger, she silently promised him that she would give him a life filled with love, strength, and possibilities. Henry was barely 3 years old, but already his curiosity seemed boundless. Naomi often found herself watching him in amazement as he tinkered with his toys, rearranging puzzle pieces or building towers that rivaled the diagrams in her old engineering textbooks. It wasn't just that he was smart. He had a focus and determination that belied his age, an intensity that sometimes made her wonder if he saw the world differently than she did. One evening, Naomi returned home after a long shift at the hospital to find Bella sitting cross-legged on the floor with Henry. The living room was a maze of colourful blocks, interspersed with miniature tools and pieces of paper covered in childlike sketches. Bella, wearing her usual amused expression, glanced up as Naomi set down her bag. "He's making me feel dumb again," Bella said, gesturing at the chaotic scene around her. "I thought we were just playing with blocks, but apparently we're designing a bridge." "A bridge?" Naomi asked, raising an eyebrow as she crouched beside them. Henry looked up, his big brown eyes lighting up with excitement. "Not just any bridge, Mommy," he said, holding up a crayon drawing. "A strong one, for trucks and people." Naomi took the paper from him, marveling at the neat lines and careful thought behind the design. She could see where he'd sketched out supports and added what looked like traffic lanes, complete with tiny arrows. "This is incredible, Henry," she said, her voice filled with pride. "Where did you learn about bridges?" Henry shrugged as if the answer was obvious. "From my books and TV, and I asked Jacob." Naomi couldn't help but laugh. Jacob had been a regular visitor at their home ever since Henry was born, his quick humor and endless patience making him a favorite of Henry's. "Well, it looks like you've been learning a lot," Naomi said, ruffling Henry's hair. "I'm going to make a real one someday," Henry declared, his tiny chest puffing with confidence. Naomi's smile faltered slightly as a flicker of concern crossed her mind. She loved her son's ambition and creativity, but she worried about the weight of expectations, whether from others or from himself. She wanted him to dream big, but she also wanted him to have the freedom to simply be a child. Later that night, after Henry had fallen asleep with his sketchbook tucked under his arm, Naomi joined Bella in the kitchen. "He's amazing, isn't he?" Bella said, pouring them both a cup of tea. "He is," Naomi agreed, her voice tinged with both awe and uncertainty. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough for him. He's so unique. What if I'm not giving him what he needs?" Bella reached across the table to squeeze Naomi's hand. "You're giving him everything that matters: love, stability, and the freedom to explore. The rest will fall into place." Naomi nodded, though her mind was already racing. She resolved to find ways to nurture Henry's gifts, to ensure he had opportunities to grow without losing sight of the joy in being a child. The next morning, Naomi's resolve to support Henry's burgeoning talents was put to the test. She had barely finished her first cup of coffee when Henry marched into the kitchen, holding one of her old medical textbooks. His tiny fingers were smudged with pencil marks, and his expression was serious. "Mommy," he said, setting the heavy book on the counter with a dramatic thud. "Can we learn about hearts today?" Naomi blinked, caught off guard. "Hearts?" she repeated, glancing at the book. It was a well-worn anatomy text she hadn't touched in years. "Where did you even find this?" "In the living room," Henry said matter-of-factly. "I like the pictures. Look." He flipped the book open to a diagram of the human heart, his small hands tracing the pathways of arteries and veins. "Is this where blood goes? And what's this word?" He pointed to the word ventricle with an expectant look. Naomi leaned down, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and disbelief. "That's a ventricle," she explained. "It's a part of your heart that helps pump blood through your body." Henry's eyes widened as he absorbed the information. "Can I see a real one? Like at your hospital?" Naomi laughed softly. "It doesn't quite work like that, buddy. But maybe one day, if you keep learning, you'll get to see how it all works." "Okay," Henry said, nodding decisively. "I'm going to be a doctor like you, Mommy." The declaration hit her harder than she expected. She knelt down to meet his gaze, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "You can be anything you want, Henry," she said, her voice steady. "Doctor, engineer, artist. You don't have to decide yet. Just promise me you'll always follow what makes you happy." Henry tilted his head, as if considering her words, then gave her a wide grin. "Okay, Mommy." That evening, Naomi called Jacob, seeking advice. Over the months, he had become not just a friend, but a confidant, someone she could trust with her worries about raising Henry. "I don't know if I'm doing this right," Naomi admitted as she paced her small living room. "He's so curious, so determined, but he's only 3. Should I be encouraging this, or am I pushing him too much?" Jacob's chuckle came through the phone, warm and reassuring. "Naomi, you're overthinking this. He's just a kid who loves learning. Let him explore, but don't forget to let him be a kid too. Take him to the park. Let him climb trees and get dirty." Naomi smiled despite herself. You're right, I just don't want to mess this up. You won't, Jacob said firmly. You're the best mom he could ask for. And if you ever need backup, you've got me and Bella. The next weekend, Naomi took Henry to the park, just as Jacob suggested. She watched him chase after butterflies, climb the jungle gym, and laugh with other children. For a while, she let herself relax, marveling at how much joy Henry brought into her life. As they headed home, Henry tugged on her hand. "Mommy, can we build a big bridge tomorrow?" Naomi squeezed his hand and smiled. "Sure, buddy, but only if you promise we can stop and play in between." "Deal," Henry said, his grin as bright as the afternoon sun. For the first time in a long while, Naomi felt a quiet confidence settle over her. She didn't have all the answers, but she had the most important thing, the unshakable bond she shared with her son. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Naomi adjusted the hem of her dress nervously as she stepped out of her car in front of the Grand Hall, hosting the Austin Children's Charity Gala. The evening air was warm, tinged with the hum of laughter and conversation from the crowd already gathered under the glowing chandeliers visible through the tall windows. This was her first public appearance since the birth of Henry, and though she was confident in her accomplishments, she couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place among the city's wealthiest elite. She checked her reflection in the glass doors before stepping inside. Her emerald green gown hugged her figure, a symbol of her resilience and determination to rebuild after Antonio's betrayal. Tonight wasn't about her. It was about the new pediatric research project she had spearheaded, one designed to provide accessible surgical care for children in underserved communities. Inside, the room buzzed with energy. Waiters weaved through the crowd with trays of champagne, while guests in tailored suits and glittering dresses exchanged pleasantries. Naomi scanned the room for familiar faces, her heart easing slightly when she spotted Bella near the bar, already chatting animatedly with a group of donors. "Dr. Ramirez," a voice interrupted her thoughts. Naomi turned to see Mr. Hollingsworth, one of the hospital's key benefactors, extending a hand. "So good to see you here tonight. I've heard remarkable things about your work." "Thank you, Mr. Hollingsworth," Naomi said with a polite smile, shaking his hand. "It's an honor to have your support." As they spoke, she felt a ripple of unease pass through the room. Conversations quieted momentarily, eyes subtly shifting toward the entrance. Naomi followed their gazes, and her breath caught when she saw Antonio. He stood in the doorway, impeccably dressed in a tailored black tuxedo, his presence commanding as ever. His sharp features were unreadable, though Naomi swore his eyes flicked toward her before quickly scanning the rest of the room. He hadn't changed much since the last time she'd seen him, but there was something different, an edge of weariness that hadn't been there before. "Is everything all right?" Mr. Hollingsworth asked, pulling Naomi's attention back to their conversation. "Yes," she replied quickly, forcing a smile. "Everything's fine." She moved away as soon as the conversation ended, weaving through the crowd toward Bella, her heart pounding. "Antonio's here," she said under her breath, the words tumbling out in a rush. Bella arched an eyebrow, glancing toward the entrance. "Well, this just got interesting. Are you okay?" Naomi took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I don't know. But I didn't come here to think about him. I have work to do." Bella nodded, giving her a reassuring squeeze on the arm. "You're right. Let him stay in the shadows. You're the one they're here to see." Naomi straightened her shoulders, her confidence returning. She turned her focus to the donors and hospital board members, throwing herself into conversations about her research and the future of pediatric care. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of Antonio's eyes on her, even when she wasn't looking in his direction. As the evening wore on, Naomi found herself swept into the rhythm of the gala. She mingled with donors, passionately explaining the impact her research could have on underserved communities. The warmth of their responses bolstered her confidence, reminding her why she was there. But every so often, she caught a glimpse of Antonio in the crowd, his presence a shadow she couldn't quite escape. At one point, she found herself alone at the refreshment table, pouring a glass of sparkling water to steady her nerves. The sound of approaching footsteps made her tense, and she turned to find Antonio standing a few feet away. His expression was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the intent in his eyes. He had sought her out. "Naomi," he said, his voice low and steady, though tinged with something she couldn't quite place. Regret. Guilt. She wasn't sure, and she wasn't sure she cared. "Antonio," she replied curtly, lifting her glass. "Enjoying the evening?" He hesitated, as though caught off guard by her composure. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "Likewise," Naomi said, keeping her tone even. She refused to let him see the storm of emotions churning inside her. Antonio glanced around the room, his gaze briefly landing on the stage, where a slideshow of the hospital's initiatives played on a large screen. "You've done well for yourself," he said, his voice softening. "The work you're doing, it's impressive." Naomi's jaw tightened. "And surprising. What did you think would happen after you left, Antonio? That I'd just fall apart and disappear?" "That's not what I meant," he said quickly, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. "It doesn't matter what you meant," Naomi interrupted, her voice firm but quiet. "What matters is that I'm here, and I'm doing exactly what I set out to do, without you." Before Antonio could respond, a voice interrupted them. "Dr. Ramirez? There you are." Naomi turned to see Mr. Hollingsworth approaching, his expression lit with excitement. "It's time for your presentation. Everyone's looking forward to hearing more about your work." "Of course," Naomi said, giving him a polite smile. She turned back to Antonio, her gaze steady. "Excuse me, I have work to do." Without waiting for a response, she strode toward the stage, her head held high. The moment she stepped under the spotlight, the tension in her chest began to ease. This was her space, her purpose. The audience quieted as she began to speak, her voice clear and confident as she described the vision behind her research. As Naomi spoke, she noticed Antonio lingering near the back of the room. He wasn't mingling or trying to draw attention to himself. Instead, he simply stood there, watching her. It unsettled her, but she forced herself to focus, pouring her energy into the presentation. By the time she finished, the room erupted in applause, and Naomi felt a surge of pride. She stepped down from the stage, greeted by a flurry of congratulations from donors and colleagues. Antonio was nowhere to be seen. Bella appeared by her side, a knowing smile on her face. "You crushed it," she said, handing Naomi a glass of champagne. Naomi smiled, the weight in her chest lifting further. "Thank you." "You know he left, right?" Bella said casually, her tone light but her eyes sharp. Naomi's smile widened. "Good." The night ended on a triumphant note. Antonio's shadow might have loomed briefly over the evening, but it didn't linger. Naomi left the gala knowing she had reclaimed the narrative of her life. Her path was clear, and nothing, not even Antonio, would pull her off course again. Naomi stared at the envelope sitting on her desk, its pristine white surface almost mocking her. The return address was unfamiliar, but the contents inside left no doubt as to who had sent it. Copies of financial documents, a summary of corporate transactions, and a handwritten note with Antonio's unmistakable signature. It was simple and direct. "We need to talk, for Henry's sake." Her first instinct was to shred the entire thing and forget it had ever arrived. Antonio had already taken enough of her time and energy. She didn't owe him anything. But the mention of Henry gave her pause. What did Antonio want now? And why did it feel like this was about more than just personal matters? Bella leaned against the doorway, her arms crossed as she watched Naomi's expression shift between anger and uncertainty. "Are you going to call him?" she asked, her tone cautious. Naomi shook her head, shoving the envelope into a drawer. "Number, whatever he's trying to pull, I'm not playing his game." "Are you sure?" Bella asked, stepping into the office. "Because that—" She nodded toward the drawer. "Doesn't look like something you can ignore." Naomi sighed, rubbing her temples. "I don't trust him, Bella. He's already proven he's willing to do whatever it takes to get what he wants. What if this is just another move to manipulate me?" Bella hesitated before sitting across from her. "Then maybe it's better to figure out what he's up to before he catches you off guard." Naomi hated that Bella was right. Antonio had a way of showing up when she least expected it, turning her life upside down in the process. She couldn't afford to let him do that again, not when she was finally regaining control. Later that evening, after Henry had gone to bed, Naomi sat in the quiet of her living room, her laptop open in front of her. The financial documents Antonio had sent were detailed, outlining a series of transactions involving Crawford Technologies over the past year. At first glance, they seemed harmless enough, standard acquisitions and mergers, but something about them didn't sit right. She frowned, scrolling through the numbers. There were discrepancies, small but noticeable if you looked closely. Certain amounts didn't add up, and a few of the subsidiary companies listed were ones Naomi had never heard of before. Her pulse quickened as she realized what this could mean. Picking up her phone, she hesitated only briefly before dialing. The line rang twice before Jacob's familiar voice answered. "Naomi? Everything okay?" "Not exactly," she said, explaining the situation as succinctly as she could. "I think Antonio's hiding something, or at least someone in his company is." There was a pause on the other end. "You're saying he's involved in fraud?" "I don't know," Naomi admitted. "But if he is, I need to find out. If this affects Henry in any way, I won't let it slide." Jacob's tone turned serious. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to help me dig," Naomi said. "Quietly. If Antonio's playing dirty, I want to know exactly how." Jacob showed up at Naomi's house the next evening, carrying his laptop and a bag of takeout. "If we're going to play detective, we might as well eat," he said with a grin, though his tone carried an undercurrent of seriousness. Naomi cleared the dining table, spreading out the documents Antonio had sent alongside her own notes. "I've already flagged a few inconsistencies," she said, pointing to highlighted sections. "Look here, this subsidiary doesn't seem to exist, at least not in any official capacity. And these payments, they're too precise, like someone's trying to hide something." Jacob leaned over the table, scanning the papers with practiced eyes. "You might be onto something. These look like shell companies, businesses created to funnel money without anyone noticing. If that's the case, it's a classic move for hiding financial misconduct." Naomi's stomach churned at the confirmation. Why would Antonio send this to me? If he's involved, why tip me off? Jacob shrugged, pulling up a spreadsheet on his laptop. Maybe he's not involved, or maybe he's trying to distance himself from whoever is. Naomi frowned, considering the possibility. Or he's setting me up for something. They worked late into the night, combing through public records and cross-referencing names. Each discovery painted a more troubling picture. One of the shell companies was linked to a contract for medical supplies, equipment meant for underserved hospitals that had mysteriously never arrived. Another was tied to an offshore account, its origins buried under layers of bureaucracy. "I don't like this," Jacob said finally, leaning back in his chair. "If this is as bad as it looks, someone's siphoning money from contracts meant to help people. And if Antonio's company is at the center of it, it could ruin him, Naomi finished, her voice heavy. But it could also affect Henry. Jacob nodded grimly. Especially if this goes public. The last thing you need is a scandal dragging your son's name through the mud. Naomi's thoughts raced. She wanted to protect Henry above all else, but a part of her also felt a responsibility to expose the truth. If Crawford Technologies was involved in fraud, countless lives could be impacted, including the very patients she fought for every day. "Do you think Antonio knows about this?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Jacob hesitated. "I don't know. But if he does, he's either panicking or trying to shift the blame. Either way, you need to be careful." The weight of the situation pressed down on Naomi. She hadn't wanted to involve herself in Antonio's world again, but now she felt trapped between her past and her present. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the lives at stake and the potential fallout for her and Henry. "I need more information," she said finally, her tone resolute. "I'm not going to let Antonio, or anyone else, get away with this." Jacob gave her a small, supportive smile. "You're not in this alone. We'll figure it out together." As the night stretched into early morning, Naomi felt a familiar fire reignite within her. This was bigger than her personal history with Antonio. It was a fight for justice, for the truth, and for the future she was building for her son. Whatever Antonio's intentions were, she was ready to face them head-on. Naomi stepped into the sleek conference room at Crawford Technologies, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. The tension in the air was palpable, and the murmur of voices from the gathered board members immediately quieted as she entered. The large glass windows offered a panoramic view of downtown Austin, but Naomi's focus was fixed on the long table where Antonio sat at the head, his expression unreadable. She had received the invitation to the emergency board meeting just 2 days earlier, though invitation felt like a generous term. It was clear from the tone of the email that her presence was expected, demanded even. After uncovering the trail of discrepancies in the company's financial records, she wasn't surprised. Antonio must have realized she was closing in on something, and now he was making his move. "Dr. Ramirez?" Antonio greeted her as she approached, his voice calm but edged with something sharper. "Thank you for joining us. I believe you know most of the board members." Naomi nodded curtly, taking the seat at the far end of the table, directly opposite Antonio. She set her folder on the table, her fingers brushing over the edge as she steadied herself. "Of course. Thank you for inviting me." Antonio's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned to the board. "As you all know, we're here to address concerns about recent financial activities involving the company. Dr. Ramirez has brought forward some allegations, and I thought it best to resolve this matter transparently." Naomi's jaw tightened. Allegations. He was already framing her findings as speculation, but she refused to be intimidated. "This isn't about allegations," she said, her voice steady. "It's about facts. And if you'll allow me, I'd like to present what I've discovered." The room shifted, murmurs spreading among the board members. Antonio gestured for silence, his expression carefully neutral. "By all means." Naomi stood, opening her folder and pulling out the documents she and Jacob had spent days poring over. She handed copies to the nearest board members before stepping toward the screen at the front of the room, where a projector waited. "This," she began, pointing to the first slide, "is a series of transactions involving Crawford Technologies and several subsidiaries. At first glance, they appear legitimate, standard payments to contractors and suppliers. But upon closer inspection, you'll notice discrepancies in the amounts and destinations." She clicked to the next slide, showing a flowchart of the shell companies Jacob had helped her map out. These entities are registered offshore with no clear ownership or operational history. They exist only on paper, and the funds funneled through them vanish into untraceable accounts. The murmurs grew louder as Naomi clicked to the next slide, detailing the missing medical supplies meant for underserved hospitals. This isn't just financial mismanagement, it's theft. Money meant to save lives has been siphoned away, leaving hospitals without the resources they desperately need. One of the board members, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, leaned forward. "Dr. Ramirez, these are serious accusations. Do you have evidence tying Crawford Technologies directly to these activities?" Naomi met her gaze without flinching. "The transactions were authorized by someone within the company, and while I can't say for certain who's responsible, the patterns suggest deliberate intent, not an oversight." Antonio finally spoke, his voice calm but laced with subtle derision. "Are you suggesting I'm involved in this, Naomi?" She turned to face him, her expression unyielding. "I'm suggesting that as CEO, it's your responsibility to explain how this happened under your watch." Antonio leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady as the room held its collective breath. "I appreciate your concern for the company's integrity, Naomi," he said smoothly, "but your conclusions are premature at best. Without definitive proof, all you're doing is casting doubt on an organization that has done more good than harm." Naomi's eyes narrowed. "Good doesn't erase harm, Antonio, and these numbers don't lie." The sharp-eyed board member from earlier interjected, "If what Dr. Ramirez is saying is true, then this isn't just a matter of reputation, it's a matter of legal liability. We need to investigate thoroughly." Another board member, a man with graying hair and a stern expression, nodded in agreement. "Agreed. We can't afford to ignore this." Antonio's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "And we won't. I've already taken steps to address any potential irregularities. An internal audit is underway." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "An audit led by people you appoint? That's hardly impartial, Antonio." His patience appeared to fray at the edges. "Do you have an alternative suggestion, Naomi? Or are you here simply to tear down everything this company has built?" "I'm here because lives are at stake," Naomi shot back, her voice rising slightly. "Because patients in underserved communities are waiting for supplies that never arrived. Because if we don't address this now, it won't just be your reputation that suffers, it'll be theirs." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the board. Antonio's expression hardened, but he didn't respond immediately. Naomi could see the calculation in his eyes, the gears turning as he weighed his options. Finally, the sharp-eyed woman broke the silence. "I think Dr. Ramirez has a point. An independent investigation is the only way to ensure transparency and accountability." The room erupted in murmurs again, and Antonio raised a hand to quiet them. "If that's the board's decision, then so be it," he said, his tone clipped. "I have nothing to hide." Naomi resisted the urge to roll her eyes. His bravado was paper-thin, but at least the board seemed to be taking her seriously. She glanced around the room, gauging the reactions. Some members appeared skeptical, but others seemed genuinely concerned. As the meeting began to wind down, Antonio turned his attention back to Naomi. "You've made your position clear, but I hope you realize the implications of what you're doing." Naomi met his gaze head-on. "I do." "Do you?" His lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't answer. Instead, he gathered his papers and stood. "Thank you, everyone. We'll reconvene once the investigation is underway." As the board members began to file out, Naomi stayed behind, gathering her documents. Bella, who had accompanied her as moral support, approached with a wry smile. "Well, that was intense." Naomi exhaled, the adrenaline finally ebbing. It's not over yet. Bella nodded toward the door where Antonio had just exited. He's not going to take this lying down, you know. I know, Naomi said, clutching her folder tightly. But neither will I. As they left the building, Naomi felt a mix of exhaustion and determination. She had stood her ground, but she knew this was just the beginning. Antonio wouldn't back down easily, and the battle ahead would test her resolve in ways she hadn't yet imagined. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as Naomi took her seat at the plaintiff's table, her nerves coiled tightly beneath her composed exterior. The custody hearing had brought a storm of emotions she hadn't anticipated, each one threatening to spill over as she glanced across the room. Antonio sat at the defendant's table, his posture impeccably straight, his face unreadable. He looked every bit the composed CEO, but Naomi could see the cracks beneath his polished surface, the faint lines of tension in his jaw, the slight furrow of his brow. The judge entered, and the room fell silent as everyone rose. Once seated, the proceedings began. Naomi's attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Claire, stood to make her opening statement. Your Honor, this case is about the well-being of a child who has thrived under the sole care of his mother, Dr. Naomi Ramirez, Claire began, her voice clear and steady. We will present evidence that maintaining the current arrangement is in the best interest of Henry Ramirez, and that any disruption to his environment would be detrimental to his development and happiness. Naomi's chest tightened as Claire spoke, her mind flashing to the countless moments she'd shared with Henry. His laughter, his boundless curiosity, his quiet determination. He was her whole world, and the thought of losing even a part of him to Antonio was unbearable. Antonio's attorney, a slick man with a penchant for dramatic flair, rose to deliver his counter-argument. Your Honor, while we do not dispute Dr. Ramirez's love for her son, we believe it is equally important for Henry to have the influence and resources of his father, Antonio Crawford. Mr. Crawford is prepared to demonstrate his commitment to providing Henry with every advantage in life, including stability and opportunities that only he can offer. Naomi clenched her fists under the table, her frustration simmering. Antonio's version of stability was built on a foundation of half-truths and carefully constructed facades, and she refused to let him rewrite history to suit his narrative. The first witness called was Bella, who had been a constant presence in Henry's life since his birth. She spoke confidently about Naomi's dedication as a mother, her ability to balance a demanding career with the needs of her son, and the nurturing environment she had created. Henry is thriving because of Naomi, Bella said firmly. She's not just his mother, she's his anchor. She's given him love, security, and the freedom to explore his incredible potential. The opposing attorney's cross-examination was sharp, but Bella didn't falter. When asked about Naomi's demanding career, Bella countered with examples of how Naomi ensured Henry was always supported, whether by herself or through their close-knit circle of friends. As Naomi watched Bella hold her ground, a flicker of hope ignited within her, but she knew this was only the beginning. Antonio's legal team had yet to play their hand, and she braced herself for whatever came next. The tension in the room thickened as Antonio himself was called to the stand. He adjusted his tie as he took his seat, exuding the calm confidence of a man accustomed to being in control. But Naomi, watching him closely, saw the subtle cracks, a flicker of unease in his eyes, the way his hands gripped the edges of the stand a little too tightly. Mr. Crawford, his attorney began, pacing slowly in front of the jury box. Could you tell the court why you're seeking joint custody of Henry Ramirez? Antonio cleared his throat, his voice smooth but deliberate. Henry is my son, and I want to be part of his life. It's not just about my rights as a father. It's about giving him access to everything he deserves. I can provide stability, resources, and a broader range of opportunities to help him reach his full potential." Naomi fought the urge to scoff. Stability? Resources? As if love and presence could be replaced by money. The attorney pressed on. "Some might argue that you've been absent for much of Henry's life. How would you respond to that?" Antonio's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone measured. "I made mistakes. I wasn't there when Henry was born, and I deeply regret that. But I've taken steps to make amends. I'm here now, and I want to build a relationship with my son." The words were crafted perfectly for the courtroom, but Naomi couldn't forget the years of silence, the willful absence, or the cold dismissal of her and Henry's existence. Still, she reminded herself to stay calm. She had her turn to counter, and she would make sure her truth was heard. When Naomi's attorney rose for cross-examination, the room seemed to hold its breath. Claire approached Antonio, her expression steely but professional. "Mr. Crawford, you say you want to provide stability for Henry. Could you explain how the ongoing investigation into financial discrepancies at your company factors into that?" Antonio stiffened, his carefully composed mask slipping for a fraction of a second. "The investigation is routine," he replied. "There's no evidence linking me to any wrongdoing." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Routine investigations don't usually involve shell companies and missing funds, do they?" Antonio's lawyer quickly objected, claiming the question was irrelevant. The judge allowed the objection, and Claire shifted tactics smoothly. "Let's talk about your time in Henry's life so far. Can you name his favorite book?" Antonio hesitated. "I believe he likes stories about space." Claire tilted her head slightly, her tone calm but pointed. "Can you name his best friend, his favorite game, his favorite food?" Antonio's silence was answer enough, and Claire turned to the judge. "No further questions, Your Honor." Naomi's stomach churned as Antonio stepped down, his expression carefully neutral. The evidence of his detachment was clear, but she knew the fight wasn't over. The judge adjourned for the day, and as Naomi left the courtroom, Bella and Jacob flanked her, their presence a comforting shield. "You did great today," Bella said, squeezing Naomi's arm. Naomi nodded, though her mind raced with lingering doubts. She knew Antonio wouldn't back down easily, but she wasn't fighting for herself. She was fighting for Henry, and no matter what, she wouldn't let him down. Naomi sat at the kitchen table late into the night, her laptop screen casting a pale glow across her tired features. Stacks of legal documents, notes, and case files were spread out before her, but her attention was fixed on a single line in an email from her attorney. "We've received a subpoena for additional financial records from Crawford Technologies. This could be critical." She couldn't help but feel the walls closing in on Antonio. The investigation into his company was gaining momentum, and while it was satisfying to see justice inch closer, it also brought a sharp pang of worry. What would happen if this exploded in the courtroom? Would Antonio lash out, using Henry as leverage? The thought made her stomach churn. Bella entered quietly, a mug of tea in hand. "Still at it?" she asked, setting the cup down in front of Naomi. Naomi sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I can't stop now. If Antonio's company goes down, he'll blame me, and I have to be ready for anything. I won't let him drag Henry into his mess." Bella pulled up a chair, her expression serious. "You're doing everything you can, Naomi. Don't forget that." Naomi nodded, but couldn't shake the heavy weight of responsibility pressing down on her. "This isn't just about the custody case anymore. If the investigation confirms fraud, it could destroy Antonio, and by extension, Henry's image of him. How do I explain that to a 3-year-old? Bella gave her a small, encouraging smile. "You'll find the right words. You always do." The following day in court, the tension was palpable. The subpoenaed financial records had been entered into evidence, and Claire wasted no time highlighting the irregularities. Each slide of her presentation painted a clearer picture of mismanagement and deceit within Crawford Technologies, and the board members in attendance exchanged nervous glances. Antonio sat rigidly at his table, his attorney whispering urgently in his ear. Naomi could feel his eyes on her, the weight of his frustration burning through the room, but she refused to look at him, keeping her focus on Claire's methodical takedown. "This is about accountability," Claire concluded, her voice steady. "Dr. Ramirez has shown her dedication to her son's well-being, both in her personal life and through her tireless work in the medical community. In contrast, Mr. Crawford's leadership at his company has raised serious questions about his ability to provide the stability and trust that Henry deserves." As Claire took her seat, Naomi felt a surge of hope. But as Antonio stood to deliver his rebuttal, the flicker of optimism wavered. He adjusted his tie, his expression carefully controlled. "Your Honor," Antonio began, his voice measured, "I understand the court's concerns, but I'd like to offer a different perspective. Yes, mistakes were made under my leadership, but I have taken every step to address them. My commitment to Henry remains unwavering." Antonio continued, his tone growing more deliberate as he scanned the room. "It's true that I was absent from Henry's early years, and I take full responsibility for that. But I've worked hard to correct my mistakes, and I'm here now. Henry deserves the chance to know his father, to have access to every opportunity I can provide." He paused for effect, his gaze shifting briefly to Naomi. "I respect Dr. Ramirez and everything she's done for our son. But I believe a balanced upbringing, one that includes both parents, is what's best for him." Naomi felt a surge of frustration at Antonio's carefully crafted words. He was painting himself as the picture of redemption, but she knew better. His sudden involvement in Henry's life was less about love and more about control, another way to assert his power. Claire rose to her feet, her expression calm but sharp. "Mr. Crawford, you've mentioned opportunities several times. Could you clarify what you mean by that?" Antonio adjusted his tie, his composure faltering slightly. "I mean educational resources, connections, financial stability, things that can help Henry succeed in the future." Claire tilted her head. "So, you're suggesting that money and influence outweigh the consistent love and care Henry has received from his mother?" "That's not what I'm saying," Antonio replied quickly, but the undercurrent of tension in his voice was unmistakable. Claire pressed on, her tone unwavering. "Then, explain this. If Henry's well-being is your priority, why haven't you been involved in his day-to-day life until now? Why did it take a custody hearing for you to show interest in being a father?" The courtroom fell silent, all eyes on Antonio. For a moment he hesitated, the cracks in his carefully constructed facade beginning to show. But before he could respond, the judge interjected. "That's enough for now," the judge said, her voice firm but even. "We'll take a recess before hearing closing statements." Naomi exhaled, the tension in her chest easing slightly as the judge exited the room. Bella appeared at her side moments later, squeezing her shoulder. "He's losing his grip," she said quietly. "You've got this, Naomi." Naomi nodded, but her thoughts were far from settled. As she gathered her notes, Antonio approached, his expression unreadable. "Naomi," he began, his voice low. "This doesn't have to get uglier than it already is." She turned to face him, her eyes steady. "If you truly care about Henry, you'll stop fighting and let him stay where he belongs." Antonio's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. He turned and walked away, leaving Naomi with a mix of relief and apprehension. She knew the battle wasn't over, but for the first time she felt like the tide might finally be turning in her favor. As the courtroom began to empty, Naomi glanced at the chair where Henry's guardian ad litem, a neutral party appointed to represent his best interests, had been sitting. The woman's thoughtful expression gave Naomi hope that her story was being heard. Back at home that evening, Naomi sat with Henry in her lap, reading his favorite bedtime story. His laughter filled the room as she turned the pages, his small hand clutching hers tightly. She kissed the top of his head, silently promising that she would protect him no matter what. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation as the doors to the Ramirez Center for Pediatric Innovation opened for its inaugural event. Naomi stood near the entrance, greeting guests as they arrived. Donors, hospital staff, and community leaders who had supported her vision from its earliest stages. The center was a culmination of years of tireless work, and tonight, for the first time, it felt real. Naomi wore a sleek navy dress, her hair swept back into a low bun. Though her outward appearance radiated confidence, she felt a quiet nervousness bubbling beneath the surface. This event wasn't just a celebration of the center's opening. It was a declaration of her independence, her success, and her commitment to improving children's lives. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the thought that Antonio might use this moment to make another move. Bella appeared at her side, holding a clipboard and flashing Naomi an encouraging smile. "The turnout is incredible," she said, her voice brimming with excitement. "I think you've officially outdone yourself." Naomi chuckled softly. "Let's just get through tonight without any disasters." "Disasters? At your event?" "Never," Bella teased. "Now go mingle. People are here to celebrate you." As Naomi moved through the room, she caught snippets of conversation and warm congratulations. It was heartening to hear how much the center meant to the community, proof that her hard work was paying off. She paused near a display highlighting the center's core initiatives, reading the plaque beneath a photo of the team that had brought the project to life. Her name was there, etched in gold letters, and for the first time in years, she felt a sense of pride unclouded by doubt or fear. The sound of a familiar voice pulled her attention, and she turned to see Antonio standing near the back of the room, speaking with one of the event organizers. Her stomach twisted, but she refused to let his presence derail the night. Antonio caught her gaze and, after a brief exchange with the organizer, made his way toward her. Naomi squared her shoulders, preparing herself for whatever he had to say. "Naomi," he began, his tone carefully neutral, "this is impressive." "Thank you," she said coolly, folding her arms across her chest. "I wasn't expecting you to come." Antonio hesitated, his expression unreadable. "I wanted to see it for myself. You've built something incredible here." Naomi raised an eyebrow, unsure of his angle. "I didn't build it alone. A lot of people made this happen." "I know," Antonio said, his voice softening. "But it wouldn't exist without you." Naomi's heart twisted at his words, but she didn't let it show. "If you're here to make a scene, I suggest you leave." "I'm not," Antonio replied quickly. "I just wanted to tell you that I respect what you've done. And no matter what happens in court, I'll make sure this place stays untouched." Naomi studied him carefully, searching for any trace of manipulation or deceit. But for once, his words seemed genuine. Still, she wasn't ready to let her guard down. "Thank you," she said after a moment. "But my work here doesn't need your approval or your protection." Antonio nodded, stepping back as a staff member approached Naomi with a clipboard. "I'll leave you to your guests," he said quietly, before turning and walking away. The applause filled the auditorium as Naomi stepped onto the stage, the spotlight illuminating her against the backdrop of the Ramirez Center's logo. She took a deep breath, scanning the crowd filled with supporters, friends, and colleagues. Her heart swelled with a mix of pride and humility as she approached the podium. "Good evening, everyone," Naomi began, her voice clear and steady despite the flicker of nerves. "Tonight isn't just the celebration of a building or an idea. It's the culmination of a dream to create a place where every child, no matter their background or circumstances, can receive the care and opportunities they deserve." The crowd quieted, hanging on her words. Naomi spoke from the heart, recounting the challenges she'd faced as a single mother and the inspiration she found in Henry's resilience and curiosity. Her voice wavered slightly when she mentioned the children who would benefit from the center, her emotions raw but controlled. By the time she finished, the room erupted in applause, a standing ovation echoing off the walls. Backstage, Bella was waiting with a glass of water and a wide grin. "You nailed it," she said, handing Naomi the glass. "I saw a few tears in the audience." Naomi smiled, the weight of the evening lifting slightly. "Thank you. I just hope it inspires people to keep supporting the work we're doing here." "It will," Bella said confidently. "This place is already a game changer." Naomi took a moment to soak in Bella's words, letting the realization settle. She had built something meaningful, something that would outlast her. It wasn't just about proving herself anymore. It was about the impact she could make. As the event wound down, Naomi found herself surrounded by guests offering congratulations. She smiled and nodded, her gratitude genuine, but her attention kept flickering to the back of the room. Antonio was gone, leaving behind an empty space where he had stood earlier. It was a relief, but it also left her with an odd sense of incompleteness. Later that evening, as she returned home, Henry ran to greet her at the door, his arms outstretched. Naomi scooped him up, holding him close as he peppered her with questions about the event. "Did they like it, Mommy? Did you tell them about the robots?" he asked, referring to a part of the center's technology initiative that had captivated his imagination. "They loved it," Naomi said, smiling as she kissed his forehead. "And yes, I told them about the robots. They're excited to see what we can do." Henry's eyes lit up, and he nodded sagely. "We're going to help a lot of kids, right?" "We are," Naomi said, her voice firm with conviction. "Because that's what we do. We help." As Henry drifted off to sleep later that night, Naomi sat by his bedside, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. Her heart felt full, not just with love for her son, but with the knowledge that she was building a life and legacy that mattered. Tomorrow, the custody battle would continue, and the challenges wouldn't disappear. But tonight, she allowed herself to savor this victory, however small. She was creating something lasting, not just for Henry, but for every child who would walk through the doors of her center. And that was worth fighting for. Naomi sat in her car outside the community hospital, her fingers gripping the steering wheel as she stared at the brick facade. It had been Antonio's idea to meet here. A neutral ground, he'd said, away from the courtrooms and boardrooms that had defined their recent interactions. She wasn't sure what to expect, but the tone of his message had been different, softer somehow. Against her better judgment, she had agreed. The parking lot buzzed with activity as nurses, patients, and visitors moved in and out of the building. Naomi took a steadying breath and stepped out of the car, the crisp morning air biting at her skin. Inside, the hospital was a far cry from the polished halls of Crawford Technologies. The linoleum floors were worn, the walls painted a dull beige, but the air was filled with a palpable sense of purpose. Antonio was waiting in a small conference room off the main hallway. He stood as she entered, his expression unreadable, but his posture less rigid than she was used to. He looked almost tired. She closed the door behind her and took a seat across the table, setting her bag beside her. "Thank you for coming," Antonio said, his voice quiet. I'm not here for pleasantries, Naomi replied, her tone clipped. What do you want? Antonio nodded, as if he'd expected her sharpness. I wanted to talk, without lawyers, without an audience, just us. Naomi folded her arms, leaning back slightly in her chair. Talk about what? Antonio hesitated, his gaze dropping briefly to the table before meeting hers again. About Henry. About everything. Her stomach twisted at the mention of their son. Go on. Antonio exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I know I've made mistakes, more than I can count, and I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness, especially from you. But I need you to know that I'm trying to be better for Henry's sake. Naomi studied him, searching for signs of manipulation. But his words lacked the usual calculated undertone she had come to expect. He sounded genuine. Still, she wasn't ready to let her guard down. Why now? She asked. Why not 3 years ago, when I needed you, when Henry needed you? I don't have a good answer, Antonio admitted, his voice heavy with regret. I was selfish. I put my career, my ambitions, above everything else, and by the time I realized what I'd lost, I didn't know how to fix it. Naomi's throat tightened, her emotions threatening to spill over. You can't just show up now and expect everything to be okay, Antonio. Henry isn't some project you can take on when it's convenient. I know, Antonio said quickly. That's not what this is. I don't expect to undo the damage I've done overnight. But I want to try, Naomi. I want to be part of his life, even if it's only in a small way. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging between them. Naomi's mind raced, torn between the protective instincts of a mother and the lingering pain of her own betrayal. Could she trust him? Did Henry even need him in his life? Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. A young nurse poked her head in, her expression apologetic. Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Crawford. The supplies for the pediatric ward just arrived. Antonio nodded, standing. I'll be right there. Naomi frowned. Supplies? Antonio turned back to her. I've been volunteering here. After everything that happened with the company, I needed to do something real, something that mattered. Her skepticism must have shown because he added, I'm not trying to impress you, I just needed to feel like I was doing something good. Naomi stood, gathering her things. If you're serious about this, Antonio, it's not me you need to convince, it's Henry. Antonio nodded slowly, his gaze steady. I know. Over the next few weeks, Antonio's actions spoke louder than his words. Naomi hadn't expected much from their conversation at the hospital, just another round of empty promises that would eventually fade into nothing. But to her surprise, Antonio kept showing up, not with grand gestures, but with quiet, steady effort. He began spending time at the community hospital almost daily, working alongside the staff to organize supplies, clean facilities, and assist with non-medical tasks. Naomi heard about his efforts through Bella, who had connections at the hospital and was more than willing to keep tabs on him. He's actually doing it, Bella said one evening over dinner, her tone tinged with disbelief. No press, no cameras, just helping. It's weird. Naomi sipped her tea, torn between cautious hope and lingering skepticism. Maybe he's trying to prove something, or maybe it's guilt. Could be both, Bella admitted. But if it's genuine, it might not be the worst thing for Henry to see. Naomi nodded, her thoughts drifting to her son. Henry had asked about Antonio a few times since the custody hearings began. He was too young to fully understand the situation, but he was old enough to notice changes. Naomi had always been careful with her answers, not wanting to paint Antonio as a villain, but also unwilling to offer false hope. One Saturday afternoon, Antonio called, asking if he could visit Henry. Naomi hesitated but agreed, setting clear boundaries. You can come over for an hour, she said firmly, and only if Henry wants to see you. When Antonio arrived, he was dressed casually, a stark contrast to the polished suits he used to wear. He carried a small gift bag, but his demeanor was subdued, almost nervous. Naomi watched from the kitchen as he greeted Henry, crouching to meet his son's curious gaze. "Hi, Henry," Antonio said softly. I'm your dad." Henry blinked, studying him with the unfiltered honesty of a child. "Mommy said you live far away." "I used to," Antonio admitted, "but now I'm closer. I want to spend time with you, if that's okay." Henry tilted his head, considering this. "Do you like robots?" Antonio smiled faintly. "I think they're pretty cool. Do you?" Henry nodded eagerly, grabbing Antonio's hand and leading him to the living room where his latest creation, a makeshift robot built from cardboard and old electronics, sat waiting. Naomi watched from a distance, her heart a mix of anxiety and tentative relief as Henry chattered away, showing Antonio every detail of his invention. After an hour, Naomi stepped into the room, signaling the visit was over. Antonio stood, thanking her quietly before turning back to Henry. "I'll see you soon, okay?" "Okay," Henry said, waving cheerfully. When the door closed behind Antonio, Naomi leaned against it, letting out a long breath. Bella, who had been lurking in the kitchen, peeked out with a sly grin. "Well, how do you feel?" "Like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop," Naomi admitted. "But maybe he's trying." "That's a start," Bella said, pouring them both a glass of wine. Over time, Antonio's visits became more frequent. He joined Naomi and Henry at the park, sat through bedtime stories, and even attended one of Henry's science fairs, blending quietly into the background. He didn't push for more than Naomi was willing to give, and for the first time she began to wonder if Antonio truly was trying to change. Not for her, but for Henry. Still, Naomi remained cautious. She knew their history couldn't be erased, and forgiveness didn't come easily. But as she watched Antonio help Henry assemble a new robot one evening, his laugh echoing through the room, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope that perhaps they could find a way forward. If not as a family, then at least as co-parents united by their love for their son. The auditorium buzzed with energy as parents, teachers, and students filled the seats, the stage set for the Regional Science Fair Awards ceremony. Naomi sat near the front with Bella and Jacob, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Beside her, Henry fidgeted with a nervous excitement, his eyes darting between the stage and the model of his robot displayed near the judges' table. "You're going to do great," Naomi whispered, squeezing his hand. "No matter what happens, I'm so proud of you." Henry grinned up at her, his confidence shining through. "Thanks, Mommy." The past few months had been a whirlwind of change, but this moment felt like a culmination of everything Naomi had fought for, her son's happiness, his growth, and his sense of security. Antonio's efforts to be present in Henry's life had continued, and though their co-parenting relationship was still new and tenuous, it had brought a fragile sense of balance. Antonio had taken a seat a few rows behind them, keeping a respectful distance. He had attended each step of Henry's project journey quietly, never trying to overshadow or overstep. Naomi had noticed how he kept his promises to Henry, and though she was still cautious, she couldn't deny that his consistency had made an impact. The announcer's voice crackled through the microphone, drawing the room's attention. "And now, the moment we've all been waiting for, the award for outstanding innovation in science and technology." Henry straightened in his seat, his hands clutching the edge of his chair. Naomi felt her heart race, her own nerves mirroring his anticipation. "The winner is Henry Ramirez, for his project on robotics and pediatric healthcare." The room erupted in applause, and Henry jumped to his feet, his smile so wide it lit up the room. Naomi clapped until her hands hurt, tears brimming in her eyes as she watched him walk to the stage to accept his trophy. He was small but confident, standing tall as he shook hands with the judges. When Henry took the microphone to give a brief thank you speech, his voice was steady and clear. "I want to thank my mom for always believing in me and helping me with everything, even when she's busy being a doctor," he said, glancing at Naomi, who felt a swell of emotion rise in her chest. "And I want to thank my dad, too, for helping me build my robot." The audience clapped politely, but the weight of Henry's words hung in the air for Naomi and Antonio. She turned her head slightly, catching Antonio's expression, pride and something deeper, almost like gratitude. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of understanding pass between them. After the ceremony, the crowd mingled in the exhibition area, students eagerly showing off their projects to curious onlookers. Naomi stayed close to Henry, watching as he explained his design to a group of parents and children. Antonio joined them quietly, his presence unobtrusive but supportive. "You must be proud," Antonio said softly, standing beside Naomi. "I am," she replied, her tone guarded but sincere. "He's worked so hard for this." "So have you," Antonio said, glancing at her. "Everything he is. It's because of you." Naomi didn't respond immediately, unsure of how to process his words. She knew Antonio's attempts at reconciliation were genuine, but the years of hurt couldn't simply vanish. Still, in this moment watching Henry thrive, she allowed herself to believe that progress, however slow, was possible. As the evening wound down, the crowd in the auditorium began to thin. Henry had taken his trophy and wandered over to a group of fellow students, proudly discussing their projects with the boundless energy only children could muster. Naomi stood near the back of the room, watching him with a quiet smile. The weight of the past few years seemed lighter now, replaced by a sense of accomplishment and cautious optimism. Antonio approached, his footsteps measured and his expression calm. He held a paper cup of coffee in one hand, which he offered to Naomi. "Thought you could use this," he said. Naomi hesitated for a moment before accepting it. "Thanks," she said simply, the tension between them softer now, less fraught. They stood in silence for a moment, watching Henry animatedly describe his robot to another child. Antonio broke the silence first. "He's remarkable," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "You've done an incredible job raising him." Naomi glanced at him, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. "He's everything to me," she admitted. "I just want him to have the best life possible." "So do I," Antonio said quietly. "I know I've made it hard for you to believe that, but it's the truth." Naomi studied him, her emotions a mixture of guardedness and a faint, growing sense of trust. "You've been showing up," she said finally. "For him, that matters." "I'll keep showing up," Antonio said. "Even if it's just as his co-parent, even if that's all you'll allow. I'm not walking away again." Naomi nodded, her grip tightening slightly on the coffee cup. "Good, because he deserves that." Henry bounded over to them then, his trophy clutched tightly in one hand. "Mommy! Daddy! Did you see me on stage?" he asked, his excitement infectious. "We saw," Naomi said, crouching down to his level and pulling him into a hug. "You were amazing." "You were a star," Antonio added, ruffling Henry's hair. "I'm so proud of you." Henry beamed, his eyes shining with joy. "I want to do more. Maybe next year I can build a robot that helps sick kids like Mommy." Naomi and Antonio exchanged a glance, a moment of shared pride and hope for their son's future. "I think that's a great idea," Naomi said, her voice steady. "And we'll both help you, however we can." As they left the auditorium, the night air was cool and filled with the faint hum of the city. Antonio walked a few steps behind Naomi and Henry, giving them space but remaining close enough to feel like part of the moment. Henry chattered endlessly about his plans for his next project, his enthusiasm carrying them forward. When they reached Naomi's car, Antonio hesitated. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice directed at Naomi, "for letting me be here tonight." She met his gaze, her expression soft but firm. "You earned it. Just don't make me regret it." "You won't," he promised, his tone steady. As Naomi drove home, Henry's trophy resting on the seat beside him, she glanced at her son through the rearview mirror. His eyes were already drooping, the excitement of the day giving way to exhaustion. But even in his half-asleep state, he clutched the trophy like a treasure, a symbol of his hard work and the love that surrounded him. For the first time in years, Naomi felt a sense of peace. Her journey hadn't been easy, and the road ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges. But tonight, as her son slept peacefully and the bonds of her fragile new family began to strengthen, she allowed herself to believe in a brighter future, one built on love, resilience, and the unshakable determination to move forward.